All right, everyone, it's noon, so let's go ahead and get started. Yes, I'm very loud. I probably don't even need the microphone except for the video here, so I'll try not to blow your eardrums out. But welcome to Hunting Webshells, Tracking TwoFace. My name is Josh Bryant. I'm a director of technical account management at Tanium, where I specialize in our threat response module. Prior to coming to Tanium, I worked for a little company called Microsoft, where I focused on the recovery side of incident response.
Hey folks, my name is Robert Falcone. I work for Palo Alto Networks, specifically on the Unit 42 team. I'm a threat researcher. I RE code all day and try to track adversaries as they kind of use these tools in their attack campaigns. And both Josh and I kind of came across this same incident just from two different perspectives. Josh was at Microsoft. I was at Palo Alto Networks. We were looking at the same thing from two vantage points. Okay. So let's kind of get into the content of this talk because we have a lot to talk about. Here's what we're talking about when it comes to web shells. I am not going to define what a web shell is to this crowd. I hope you all know what these things are. But what I want to talk about is the fact that there are a ton of different flavors of web shells out there, written in multiple different languages, different functionalities, capabilities, that kind of thing. So we're not going to be talking about this today because anyone can go out to a GitHub repository and download a web shell and deploy it in their operations, right? So instead, what we're going to talk about is a custom developed web shell that both Josh and I analyzed that was created by one threat group and used by that threat group in their attack campaigns. And I called it TwoFace back in 2017 because it's a cool name. That's about it. So, and I'll explain why we call it TwoFace, but so both Josh and I were looking at this. You were looking at it in 2016. I was looking at it in 2017. You're probably asking, why are we talking about it today in September 2019? Well, March 2019, we had some interesting insight. We were able to figure out a little bit more about this web shell and the group behind it, thanks to this data leak or the dump that was leaked by this Twitter handle, and I'm not going to try to pronounce that. It's like Lab Duke, whatever. This Twitter alias dumped all sorts of tools, URLs, and web shells associated with a group called Oil Rig. I think FireEye calls it APT34, whatever the name is. The benefit of this data dump, though, is that it gave us a lot of insight that we wouldn't have necessarily been able to derive from our own telemetry. Okay, and what we were able to get out of this is the expanse of the use of this TwoFace web shell. They counted 112. We counted 112 URLs that this was installed on, but that didn't include any of the URLs that we knew about from the impacted organizations that we were working with. Okay, so that number's a little higher. There were, in this data dump, there were 87 different organizations that were impacted by this, 27 different countries. This was a pretty big campaign using TwoFace. So the other thing about the dump, which was kind of interesting, we got insight into what threat actor called this web shell, and it was hypershell and high shell. Those are kind of boring names. That's why we're going to continue using TwoFace going forward. First off, because I named it, and second off, it's a much better name. Okay, so why did I call it TwoFace back in 2017? Well, the reason why I called it that was because it had two different layers to it, okay? There was a loader layer, and then there was a payload layer. The whole purpose of the loader was to be able to extract a embedded payload layer and install it onto the web server, okay? So this is what one of the loaders looks like. If you were just to navigate to it, it just looks like it's a error page from an Exchange server, okay? And speaking of Exchange server, TwoFace was deployed almost exclusively onto Exchange servers, okay? So this group is really focused on targeting Exchange servers. So if you just navigate to it looks legitimate, but it actually has a malicious payload shell embedded within it that if the adversary interacted with it in a specific way, it would drop the payload, right? So this has all the functionality that the adversary would use to start interacting with the web shell itself, like running commands, downloading files, uploading files, running SQL queries, whatever, right? So this is pretty functional. The one thing I do want to call out here is that to be able to run anything on this, you actually had to provide a password to authenticate to it. So you couldn't just stumble upon this and start executing commands on the web server, because you actually had to use a password to be able to carry out any of that activity. And that's going to become more and more important as you see, what they did and where they did it from. Okay, so real quick, how did the loader install the payload? There's kind of a complicated process. But I want to kind of highlight this using a demo in a couple of seconds. But this is what's going to happen at a very high level. The actor would have to provide a 64-byte key to the loader. Then the loader would use that key to decrypt the embedded web shell. Salt is applied as well. But then the result of that is actually used to decrypt the embedded web shell, and then the browser's redirected to it. Okay, so that's it's a fairly complicated process how it does it, and I'll show you how it does it in this demo. This is just a IIS server that I set up real quick. There's nothing else on it. I briefly mentioned earlier that this would have been in an actual operation. This would probably be an Exchange server, because that's what this threat group actually targeted. But this is just a stock IIS server that I installed for this demo. There's only one ASPX file. Sorry for the folks in the back. You can't read that. It's way too small. There's only one file on the server, and it's the loader tool, that TwoFace loader. So I'm going to visit it in the browser right now. And this is actually an edge case where they actually took their loader code and appended it to a legitimate news article on that server, okay, just to blend in, because this actually wasn't an Exchange server. So I wrote a script to take that 64-byte key, which I'll explain how we figured that out in a second. But I wrote a script to be able to provide that in the specific way to tell the loader to install or to decrypt and install the payload of the TwoFace payload. It ran. Then the web server is responding back with the content of the payload itself. So I actually scripted it to drop the payload to dropped.aspx. So if we flip back over, there's the new file that was created. I'll open that up in the browser, and there it is. So it's a little bit different than the one I showed earlier on. This one just is blue and black, but it's the same. So actually you can see here, I'm trying to run the who am I command, but it's not working, right? Like I said, you have to provide a password to be able to actually use this thing. So I provided the password, I ran some commands, and that's how the adversary would actually interact with this. Clearly they wouldn't be using my Python script, but they would have something on their end to be able to carry out that activity. So why do they do this, right? Why did they have this like multi-layer web shell? Well, the loader itself is highly obfuscated, right? It's pretty hard to detect with signatures, and endpoints are actually endpoint protection tools have difficulty trying to detecting this because they're using random names, lots of encoding, encryption, all that stuff, right? So how did we go about tracking this stuff? Okay, well, remember the installation process I mentioned that the actor had to provide a key that was then modified by a salt? Well, this is the process that it uses to do that. Then, after it applies the key salt to the key, or the salt to the key, it uses this for loop to decrypt it, and then you get your payload. Well, I don't know if you can see in the way back, but what they're doing is they're just using addition and subtraction to modify these things, right? And I'm not a crypto guy, but addition and subtraction are really bad operators to be doing any sort of, ciphers. So what did we do? Well, we just did a very, very simple crypto attack on it, just using some algebra. That's it, because we knew what the output would be, because it would be a web shell, so it's probably going to be an ASPX file. We knew the salt, and we knew the ciphertext. The one thing that we didn't know was the 64-byte key that they were going to provide at the installation time. So just simple algebra to solve for one unknown. So we wrote a script. It started outputting some stuff. And then guess what? We found the key. Now take a look at that key. It's 64 bytes long. It's just garbage. So that actually gives us a little bit more insight into what the operator was doing, the adversary was doing, because there's no way they're remembering that. So they have some sort of key storage utility on their end as well. And then there's the clear text output, which was the payload. Okay, so that's how we went about tracking this thing going forward until about, I'm going to say it was probably about June 2017. Right before we published our blog on this, the adversary kind of probably caught on to the fact that their crypto sucked. So they released a new version of this web shell where the loader didn't use that, kind of janky cipher using addition and subtraction. Instead, they started using an actual cipher. Okay, everything else is the same, but instead they used triple des. Okay, so very similar. The loader was very, very almost the same, but instead they just swapped out triple des to be a little bit more robust. So in addition to that, they started taking the same idea of bringing in some authentication to this process, where instead of just taking the actor supplied key, creating a key and using that to decrypt it, they would actually check to see if that key was legit before they did that. And this is how they did it. They had a salt, just like in the other TwoFace loader, which they'd append to the key provided by the actor. They do a SHA-1 of it, then they base64 encode it, and then check it to that hard-coded string, right? So at this point, we have no idea what the payload is in this, right? It's encrypted with triple des, so in a very long key. We have no idea how to break this because we don't have a rig to be able to brute force this. So this was a completely unknown for a while, okay? So the way that this works is it takes that key, grabs a SHA-256, takes the first 24 bytes, and that is your triple des key. All right, so we're stumped. We have no idea, what the key is here. So probably, like I said, that was June 2017. Up until the data dump that I mentioned earlier, we couldn't figure out what the payload was for this. Okay, it's just kind of a question mark. Except one of the files that was included in the dump actually exposed an oops by the developer. They included this in the loader, right? And as you can see here, this is just some HTML with a pre-tag. When you opened up the loader and did a GET request, it just displayed this, wacky string here, this NXKK string, right? We had no idea what that was for. Like, it didn't mean anything, so why would they include that? Well, it turned out that was the key. So I'm not sure if this was just a development version or what they were doing. They had a pretty big OPSEC fail. And we actually, exploited that to figure out what the payload was within this loader. So I'll just walk you through really quick how this worked and how we confirmed that was the key. So here we concatenate the salt and the key that's in that pre-tag here. We take the SHA-1 of that string. We base64 that SHA-1, and then we compare we base64 it. Then we compare the output of that to the hard-coded base64 string in that top box there. And if you actually look, they're exactly the same. So now we know that we've got the key to be able to decrypt this embedded payload that's been kind of stumping us for a long time. So another script I wrote, it just does simple, it's probably like 5 lines, just does some triple des. And there it is. That's what came out, right? Now, does that look really familiar to like slide 3 or whatever that showed the payload? Well, it kind of is, right? So I'm not sure people in the back can see that, but this is actually an animated GIF that compares the difference between that first that first payload and the one that I just extracted. And the only difference is that they added version 5.0 in the top right corner. Okay, so they add some versioning, which just seems kind of weird, especially because when we started looking at the data dump and looking at the other payloads, we got this one. This is another TwoFace payload from that dump that is version 5.0 that is clearly different, especially in visual. So they're very, very bad at versioning. But they also added some functionality here where they added some, a file system explorer on that file system, or the Explorer tab here. Another version that we saw them create was version 7.1 here. All the same functionality, all the same code. They just broke it out over several tabs here. And then you get this one, 8.6.2, where this is radically different. So this is showing that their constantly updating and developing on these web shells as they're carrying out these attack operations. Now I'm going to pass it over to Josh. He's going to show you some hunting stuff.
All right, it's time to go hunting. So I've seen a lot of people walking around the conference with T-shirts that say "Attackers Think in Graphs," and we're going to do exactly that here with a couple of quick attack graph scenarios. First one here I call an attacker's hope. This is something that we see a lot of adversaries attempt, usually unsuccessfully, but they really wish it would work. So here we have your typical environment where we have a domain admin that uses his domain admin creds for everything, and he exposes them all over the place. Next, our attacker is going to target the Exchange server directly because it's a high-value target, and it's often exposed directly to the internet so people can access things like OWA. So he's going to try a few common techniques, maybe SQL injection, remote file inclusion, cross-site scripting, local file inclusion, and maybe eventually get onto remote code execution, which is his most likely avenue. However, there aren't any known remote code execution vulnerabilities in Exchange that I can find. You may target some of the underlying components, such as IIS itself, maybe with HTTP.sys, or the underlying operating system. However, probable, but still maybe unlikely. We'll do our remote code execution. Attacker comes in, compromises the Exchange server, implants the web shell, and from here, because our domain admin uses credentials all over the place, he can use credential theft techniques and then pivot to the domain controller and now have complete control over the environment. So that's one way that these attacks can happen. What we see more often, though, is something like this, where the attacker sends a phishing campaign and our user opens it because they're excited to get mail. They love attachments, and they're more than happy to enable macros and get their machine infected. So that gives our attacker their initial foothold into the environment. But now they need to do some privilege escalation here, so they could do something like cause a little mayhem, which makes our help desk guy come out, and he's going to use his admin creds on this system and expose credentials again. In this scenario, our admin is not an Exchange admin, but he has admin privileges to the file server, and our attacker is going to use advantage of a misconfiguration that he finds on the Exchange server to now implant his web shell over there. And he doesn't necessarily need to go after domain admins because Exchange is really highly privileged inside Active Directory. He can use that to his advantage and gain access to other servers and systems in the environment. Another thing that he could possibly have done here is use something like the ruler vulnerability and technique to gain privilege escalation and lateral movement to get throughout the environment. So typically what happens here then, some time goes by. Most AV and EDR tools out there are really bad at finding web shells, especially when they're in targeted campaigns like this, but they may find the other activity that happened after the web shell was implanted. So our security guy came in and he cleaned up everything that his tools alerted him on, but maybe they often end up missing the web shell, and that gives the attacker some persistence and a way back into the environment, which brings us into our third scenario here, return of the attacker. Because that web shell got left behind and wasn't detected, our attacker can get back in, direct access to the Exchange server, and again, move laterally throughout the environment and gain complete control. So with that, I'm going to pass back to Rob here to go over what he saw the attackers doing in his investigation.
Yeah, so that was a pretty high-level scenario. I'm actually going to dig into exactly what the adversary did on one organization. Now, this is going back to 2016. I think it's June. But we actually saw this very, very similar activity carrying out all the way through January 2019 as well. So the... What? Oh, yeah, my clicker. So this slide right here, I'm just going to start with some... a pew pew map that I actually created in PowerPoint. So when you see arrows happening here, just in your head, think of the word like just two pew pew in your head. We've got an Exchange server down here in the Middle East here. It's in Saudi Arabia. I don't remember if it was there or not. But I'm just going to show you at a high level where this activity came from, and then we're going to dig into the exact commands that were issued by the adversary to carry out their activities using the web shell. So June 16th, 2016. So we have a line coming out of Iran, and there's an IP address that logs into OWA into the Exchange server. The next day, same exact IP address logs back into OWA. Then the day after, June 18th, that's when we start seeing the first web shell activity, specifically using TwoFace. It's coming from the same IP address that is, geolocated in Iran. Then September 28th, a couple months later, we see 6 commands being run from an IP address in France. A few months later, like 6 months later, there's 16 commands being run from a different IP address geolocated in France. 61 commands run in April from a US-based IP. And then finally, we see activity from an IP address in Germany running 10 commands, okay? So the one thing I do want to kind of show you at a high level is that all this activity came from different places, right? So different IP addresses, different locations, whether they're using different VPNs or they're hopping from compromised organizations, what have you. But if you think about the process that I showed earlier of the installation of this web shell, these folks aren't, or these IP addresses aren't just falling upon these web shells and running these commands. Okay, so because of the installation process and the requirement for authentication with a password, these are highly likely all the same threat group, same adversary. Okay, so let's go into exactly what they did when they had access to this Exchange server. So remember, they logged into OWA here. So what did they do? Well, at first, they came in, they started enumerating some distribution lists, and they looked at a bunch of different user accounts, which is kind of interesting, right? Want to know what they did? They used one of those distribution lists to send an email, right? And so the email is sent to the network support distribution list, and I would imagine a network support distribution list, the folks on that would have pretty high privileges, and we don't actually have the if there was any attachments or what was in the body of the email, but we believe this is them trying to compromise an endpoint that would have an admin logged into it. So they're trying to go after a system that would have an account with elevated privileges. Okay, so they came back the next day and they didn't do anything except for download the offline address book. And why would that be important, Josh?
Yeah, so again, Exchange is a very high-value target, and the address book pulls all its attributes from the objects in Active Directory on the user account. So this is going to help them identify further targets in the organization. They're going to know titles, so they can look for things like this is a system administrator or network support person, and they're also going to be able to see things like who their manager is, what their phone number is, and maybe even their physical address. So they have other avenues to attack potential targets within the organization.
Yep. So moving on, now that the next day, June 18th, this is when we first saw that first command being issued to the web shell. Now I've got like this command prompt-ish kind of box here. This isn't what the adversary would be looking at. They'd be looking at the web shell, obviously, right? But what I did want to point out here is that the top left corner, you see this OWA auth error2.aspx, and then there's error3 aspx right underneath it. Those are the two URLs for the loader and the payload. So they're using error2 to install the payload to error3, okay? So error2 is never going to change. That's actually a legitimate error message or error page in Exchange that the adversary appended their code to, okay? So that's never going to change. Only the payload file is going to change. So on June 18th, they hopped on to their web shell and ran one command, who am I? They wanted to know where they landed, so they, ran who am I. A couple months later, they come back. They upload a file, m64.exe, and and then they run it. Based off of the command line parameters, we have a pretty good idea that that's Mimikatz, just based off of the parameters, and they output the output to a text file. Then they exfiltrate the text file just by using the type command to actually just visualize that data. They probably copy and paste it right out of the web shell from there. Then this shows another kind of technique they use. They just clean up after themselves by just deleting everything that they've uploaded and generated. They delete the Mimikatz dump file. They delete the Mimikatz executable, and then they delete the TwoFace payload. Okay. Now this is actually kind of important because it shows why they have that two-layer approach with a loader and a payload, because they just delete the payload when they're done with it, and the loader remains. So it's harder to detect the obfuscated loader, so they can come back and install the payload whenever they want. Okay. A couple months later, they come back and they run this command netgroup exchange trusted subsystem. And do you want to explain what that is?
Yeah. So the Exchange Trusted Subsystem contains all the computer objects in Active Directory that the Exchange servers are, and it gives them that high level of privileges that they have in the directory and to each other. It gives each computer object admin rights to the other Exchange server as well.
Yep, and that's really important too, as you'll see. But this specific command, its output is going to be the other host names of the Exchange servers in the environment. So now they're identifying other targets that they're going to try to move to. Okay, so the next thing that they do is they try to I should say there was 4 different host names that were returned by this command. I replaced them with server name 1, 2, 3, and 4. So you'll see those on the slides. Whoa. So here you can see that they're listing the directory, trying to find where the file shares are for these servers. And you can see the third command here, they pretty much enumerated a path to the Exchange Client Access Exchange Web EWS folder. Okay, that's where the installation is for Exchange. And what they did was they then uploaded another web shell to the current web shell, and they then time-stamped that file that they just uploaded to mimic the timestamps of a legitimate file in the installation of Exchange called exchange.asmx. So what are they trying to do? They're trying to make it look like, this file was part of the Exchange installation. Okay. Right after they timestamp it, they copy it over to that other Exchange server. And the timestamping is actually kind of important for what Josh is going to talk about later on. So just keep that in mind. So what else did they do? They copied that web shell over to the other 3 Exchange servers that they found. Okay, this is them pivoting and moving laterally to other servers on the network to expand their access. Then what did they do? Before they left, they just deleted the TwoFace payload from the system just to kind of clean up after themselves. Okay, so like a month and a half later, we see the adversary come back. They were probably doing other activities on the other Exchange servers. Unfortunately, we didn't have access to the logs on that system or those systems, so we kind of lost visibility on what they were doing. But this is where they come back. They run that same command netgroup exchange trusted subsystem, and they are now trying to figure out why they lost access to one of their Exchange servers. Okay, and you'll see why we think that based off the next couple commands. So what are they trying to do here? They're trying to list the contents of that folder that they copied the Exchange web shell to, and they do that on all 4 of those servers. And then immediately after, they try pinging one of the servers because they lost access to, in this case, server number 3. And what did they do to kind of, fix that? Well, they uploaded yet another web shell to all of the Exchange servers on the network. And this wasn't even TwoFace. This was completely different. So what are they trying to do? They're trying to make sure that if the organization that is now trying to remediate their servers, hopefully they don't catch this now completely new web shell on the system as well. So what they did was they uploaded global.aspx to all those systems, all those Exchange servers. They hid it using the trib command, and so it's now hidden. But while they're at it, and while they're here, what they do is they upload yet another executable, and they run it, and it's Mimikatz. They output the contents to a text file, and then they exfiltrate it. So almost every single time they came back, they uploaded a new Mimikatz tool and tried to dump the credentials. So it was definitely a part of their playbook. Again, they delete the payload after to kind of clean up after themselves. Okay, so May 3rd, and we're kind of running out of time. May 3rd, they come back, and this is the last time we saw them. Because at this point, this is when the impacted organization was really on to, in the remediation process to get this adversary out of their network. They lost access to some of their Exchange servers. They're just trying to, recoup as much as they can. They uploaded another Mimikatz tool to the system and tried to exfiltrate those dumped credentials. And that was it. We never saw them again.
Okay, so let's talk about how we would find this type of activity from the host side. Obviously, we've been talking a lot about Exchange servers because TwoFace and many other shells target them. So first thing you're going to want to do is find out where all the Exchange servers, specifically with the client access server role, because that's going to be the internet-facing role, exist, and you could use this PowerShell command and the Exchange management shell to do that. Now, Exchange is just at least the public-facing portions of it is just a web application running on IIS. So once you find out where those servers are, you're going to want to know where the log files are. Typically, they're going to be in the default location, but it is possible, and many organizations do move those off to another drive for many different reasons. So this PowerShell command here will identify where your log files are stored. Another thing you're going to want to look at is the settings in IIS related to logging. One thing that we've seen attackers do, not necessarily this one in this campaign, but with some other web shells we found on different IIS and Exchange servers, is they'll use advanced logging to try and hide their activity. This is a built-in function in IIS, and it allows you to filter out things in the logs. The legit use of it is to make your logs a little less noisy, but attackers will use it to try and hide access to their web shell implants. Another thing you're going to want to do is, and this is something you should absolutely do proactively, don't wait until you're trying to find a web shell on your system. Make sure that you are logging cookies. This is not a field that is logged by default. And once you've found all that, it's time to take a look in those logs. Here I'm using a tool called Log Parser Studio because it has a lot of built-in functions for parsing Exchange and IIS logs specifically. First thing we're going to look for is post operations with low request accounts. These applications like Exchange have very few pages that you post to at all, but you can kind of do some long tail analysis here, right? Our top end is going to be our legitimate pages where they have lots and lots and lots of requests. And then down at the low end on that long tail, we're going to see some hits with very few requests. And there shouldn't be a whole lot of them, so they'll be easily identifiable for me. Only one of the three that I have highlighted in this screenshot is actually a web shell. The other two are legitimate. Sometimes just the way that people type things in or make typos, you'll find a few low counts in there on those, but you can very quickly rule them out as legitimate and focus your efforts on analyzing the shell that you've just found. Other thing that you're going to want to use to focus your hunt is look for URIs that don't require authentication. It doesn't make a lot of sense for me as an attacker to drop my web shell in a location that requires me to authenticate using credentials that I've obtained from my target. Because if I lose those credentials, I want a way to get back in. So in applications like Exchange, the paths that we saw on Rob's slide earlier are pre-authentication paths, and that's where they're most likely to drop them in. And you'll see that one highlighted here, that OWA auth. And then you're going to want to look for some get operations with the 404 status, meaning that the page wasn't found. And this is how I have found attacker implants and access where they have used that advanced logging to try and hide their activities. Because your adversary, especially in cases like the threat actor that use TwoFace, are humans just like us. They make mistakes. They make typos. Those typos are not going to get caught by the advanced log filtering. They're going to show up as a 404 because, I missed something like the O in error or the U in auth when I was trying to access my web shell. Once you've identified the shell, we're going to want to start seeing what did they do with their access to the Exchange server. One thing I want to note is the user agent. Now, in the case of TwoFace, they really liked old versions of Firefox for some reason, and that actually tends to stand out. It helps, if your organizations have a standard web browser that they use, but that's not always the case. And you'll still find that it tends to be unique, right? What they used is going to stand out from your legitimate activity, and it's a way that you can pivot into finding what they did. So from here, we can combine that information and identify compromised accounts. And then once we've identified compromised accounts, we can identify further activity and further compromise by looking at the client ID field in the IIS logs here. That client ID is kind of a server-side cookie reference. It's unique per computer. So if I have accessed one account from the same computer and then I log in with a different account, my client ID will stay the same, and I can identify additional accounts that have been compromised that way. So I'm going to give it back to Rob here to show some other analysis.
Yeah, so Josh was using Log Parser Studio. I don't use that. I use grep. So I just look through the logs using some simple grep. But I just want to kind of show like the things that I showed in the commands and what were run and some of the activity. This all came from IIS logs, okay? So there's a wealth of information in those logs that you can really extract and figure out what was actually done on your network. So in this case, you can actually see this is the URL that was accessed to read the address book, specifically looking for specific. I think this was a mailbox user. So they're looking for a specific person in this case. That's in that yellow highlight. And this green highlight box, that's the kind of the redacted IP address that was carrying out that activity. So it's a routable IP address, and that's the one that was geolocated in Iran. Here's another one of those logs that I found. This is the actual sending of the email. You can actually see it's using the Exchange to send this email. You can see the recipients. You can see the NM, I guess, is the word for subject or the parameter for the subject here. And you can see again in that green box, it's that same IP address. Now, from the commands that were issued to TwoFace itself, all the commands were just passed through the cookie field. So that's getting back to what Josh said. If we didn't have cookies enabled on this organization's IIS server, we would have had no idea what the adversary ran from a command perspective. But here you can see that same IP address here was interacting with a post request to a TwoFace payload. And there in that cookie I highlighted in yellow, that's where the who am I command was issued.
All right, all hope is not necessarily lost if you don't have that cookie field available in your logs. You can also look for suspicious process creation in your Windows event logs. However, this is another thing that isn't enabled by default. You need to make sure that you have enabled process creation policy, so you can look for either the 4688 event, or if you're using Sysmon, event ID 1. And what you're going to want to, or you could use any other tool out there. There's a lot of different tools on the market that will record process creation. And then what you're going to look for is the W3WP process, which is the IIS worker spawning different things. It's not normal for this to happen. Usually that process is only going to be creating the application pools and things like that. So if you remember back, we're talking about that who am I command being issued, that'll show up in those event logs and in that process creation. Now, when you run that, you'll typically get return NT authority system, because this process or the parent process is running under the system context, which means you are that Exchange server, and that gives you those really powerful privileges to move throughout the environment. So that's another thing you really want to look out for when you're hunting and investigating on your Exchange servers here. Next, I have a tool that I wrote a couple years ago called Invoke Exchange Web Shell Hunter. And this is looking at the install date, which is stamped on the Exchange server object in Active Directory. And it is updated every time a cumulative update in Exchange 2013 and later is installed, and comparing against the timestamp in the master file table. And I got to give a shout out to Jared Atkinson for helping me out with this and let me borrow some code from Power Forensics. But this will quickly identify anything that's out of place on the Exchange server, because the script focuses on the Exchange install directory, as well as keeping the focus on those paths that do not require authentication to access. So with that, you should be able to use most of these hunting techniques in our final attack graph scenario here to kind of get our adversary out of the environment. Here, we're asking for some DFIR help. Our expert comes in, and most investigations don't necessarily start with the Exchange server, but as you see, there's a lot of quick wins you can have there. So if you're coming in doing some proactive threat hunting, start there, use what you just learned today, and from there, you can start tracing back through the environment and find out what else the attacker did once they were in, or maybe even trace back to the start of the compromise there and end up cleaning everything out. I also wanted to talk about some mitigation. So we talked about, how to find this and analyze the activity if it's happening in there. But I think it's just as important to take some steps to try and prevent this from happening in the first place. Now, I don't want to sound like the, hey, just patch your systems guy, right? But patch your systems. First one that you're going to want to make sure you pay attention to is this vulnerability here that was related to Priv Exchange, which was kind of announced earlier this year. And then these patches help mitigate against Priv Exchange as well. They reduce the overprivileged aspect of Exchange in Active Directory. And then also make sure that your Outlook systems, or any system running Outlook, is patched for that ruler vulnerability. And then there's a blog article that I wrote a while back that will tell you how to further reduce the impact that Exchange has in your Active Directory environment. And I'll make these slides available tomorrow when I get home so everybody can have the reference points. And then finally, you want to implement secure administration practices. So if you're using things like privileged access workstations and laps and whatnot, you're going to reduce the chance that the attacker has the ability to move laterally and make their way to your Exchange server to implement a web shell or implant a web shell on that. And so with that, I think we got a couple minutes left. We're just almost out of time, but if we have any questions, yeah.
Curious if you've seen this targeting mail hosting companies or cloud mail hosts, because that could get even more scary.
It could, yes. So I have not this one specifically seen some go after mail hosts, but not the big ones that are out there. So like your Office 365s and Gmail and whatnot are really good at preventing this sort of thing from happening, but kind of your lower, more mom and pop server hosting mail type places, definitely. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you have any theories as to why the attacker passed the command to the cookie and not by any other means?
The question was why the developer of the web shell used cookies to pass the commands. I don't know, because some versions they use the post data parameters in the data itself. It could also be the fact that by default IIS doesn't log that, so it just kind of flies under the radar. But I'm not quite sure. One of the other things is if you are doing any sort of network capture, these would kind of be right there in the PCAP. So I honestly don't know. It's pretty noisy.
Way in the back.
Yeah. Did you have any insight into what the actors did with the dump threats for Mitigation outside of their expertise in Webshells?
So not specifically. We actually lost visibility on that. But if you look at most of the things that they're doing, they're using creds to just kind of spread all over. So we don't know their mission objective, what they were trying to get to, but they were clearly using dumped credentials and stolen credentials to move to other places to try to get to whatever they were looking for.
Yeah, one thing I'll add to that, if you've never run Mimikatz on an Exchange server, it's like it'll just rain creds if you run it on there. So it gives them access to other mailboxes. And as you saw, they were very interested in going through and accessing different mailboxes and gathering data out of the email environment itself. But again, it gives them further access into their target so they can exfiltrate data. Other questions? I think that's all right. Thank you guys so much for hanging out and being here late on the last day of Derbycon. We're very, very honored to be here. Thank you guys.